Hello, Mr. Wonkin here. I'd like to go over and discuss, analyze another classic film today, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, a couple of notes on this. What I'm going to talk about is the movie, not the novel. I haven't read the novel. I've read some of Ken Casey's other novels. I'm speaking about the film starring Jack Nicholson. It's a pretty good film. And, of course, I'm analyzing it, so I'm going to be talking about some significant plot points. There will be some spoilers, so just keep that in mind. To begin with, I'm going to give a little overview. You can skip ahead if you don't want to hear the overview, just to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Basically, the film goes like this. We've got our main character, played by Jack Nicholson, is a guy named McMurphy, and he's transferred from a work prison to a mental institute. And because he kept getting in trouble at the work prison, he didn't want to work, he's always getting into fights and things like that. And the warden wasn't certain that he was sane. He wanted him to be evaluated psychologically. In the ward where McMurphy is placed, we have an ensemble of patients, and that's kind of our group that the film follows. And then we have a character named Nurse Ratched, and she's sort of the antagonist of the film. Nurse Ratched is very, very controlling, very regimented in the way she runs things, and she doesn't give the patients in the hospital much freedom. She's kind of tough, you know. McMurphy, on the other hand, is kind of wild and crazy and doesn't follow rules, which is part of the reason why he was in prison. And so what happens in the film is when McMurphy comes into the hospital, we go through a series of him kind of riling up, stirring up trouble among the inmates, as well as sort of drawing some of them out and dealing with, at least on a surface level, some of their psychological problems. And so, for instance, we have a character named Chief, who, well, everybody calls him Chief. He doesn't speak. He's this very large Native American gentleman, and he's nonverbal, and so they talk. Chief doesn't talk; he's mute. And one of the things that McMurphy does throughout the film is he gets Chief to talk, and he has some very small, very limited conversations with him. So he draws these guys out. He kind of riles them up. He gets them playing poker. He takes them out on a kind of a escape field trip. He takes them out on a bus and they go on a fishing trip. He causes all kinds of trouble with them. And all of this culminates in a big party. He bribes the night guard, the night orderly, with sex and booze, basically. He has this woman have sex with him and gives him a bunch of booze. And he just gets everybody rip-roaring drunk, has this huge party. And as a result of that, everything kind of falls apart from there, and some pretty negative things happen. One of the characters ends up committing suicide. McMurphy himself is lobotomized, and so now he's just this kind of zombie. And the final plot movement is when McMurphy is brought back in, and Chief realizes that McMurphy has been lobotomized and now he's just basically brain dead. He suffocates McMurphy, breaks a window, and escapes. And then we end the film with Chief running away, you know, into the distance outside of the asylum. That's a very, very, very much an oversimplification. Now, I first saw this film, well, actually about 30 years ago when I was in high school. And so I was a teenager. I was a little naive. And I read it like this. I saw it as sort of a rebellious, anti-establishment statement. And that actually goes along with Ken Casey's writing. Ken Casey, the famous member of the Merry Pranksters, was very anti-establishment, anti-authority, and kind of a freewheeling, freedom-loving, rebellious type of hippie character, right? So that goes along with his lifestyle and ideology. And I read it like that, you know. So you have Nurse Ratched, who's very strict, very tough, allows no freedom. And then you have McMurphy coming in, and he kind of draws everybody out, and he kind of has everybody have fun, and he wants to kind of push on her limits that she puts on them to allow them to enjoy themselves and to allow them to kind of come out of their shells a little bit. And so it actually works, right? And then at the end, Chief is sort of the symbolic representative of all of these people who've been repressed by too much control, escaping, and he frees himself and gets away. And of course, he does kill McMurphy. I kind of had a problem with that when I was a kid. Never really understood that. But McMurphy's just a shell at that point, right? So him killing him was actually sort of setting him free to a certain extent on a certain symbolic level. That was, and like I said, that was kind of the naive teenage me interpretation of it. It's an anti-establishment, rebellious, pro-freedom, pro-free lifestyle film that is speaking out against an oppressive society. And Nurse Ratched represents the oppressive society. McMurphy represents the voice of freedom, the characters like the Merry Pranksters. Now, when I watched it again recently, my perspective is a little bit different. So I saw some things, I noticed some things that the naive teenage version of me didn't see. And so it's kind of interesting. Freedom and sort of pushing against a too controlled or an excessively controlled society, it still works to a certain extent. But there are some problems with looking at it as only that. We still have Nurse Ratched, who is this regimented, control-obsessed tyrant, sort of. And she lets her impulse toward control push her to make decisions that are actually bad for the patients. So, for instance, there's a scene toward the beginning in which they're having a kind of a group therapy session. And she encourages all of these men to talk about some marital problems that one specific man in the group had. And it becomes just this chaotic mess. And she kind of seeds that chaos with, encouraging people to talk about the man's wife questioning his manhood. And it's implied that the man is a repressed homosexual. And so then that's a sore subject for him. And so she kind of sets up this kind of chaotic interaction between these people because she can, You almost get the sense that there's a little bit of sadism in the way that she treats them. But at the same time, there are some hints, although it's subtle, that she does actually care about these men. And part of the problem in the way that she treats them is not that she really wants to hurt them, although I said there's some slight implications of a little bit of sadistic edge to the way she treats them. You do get, and you get in the way that she acts toward them, that she does actually care about them. She does actually want them to get better, but medical science hasn't really developed the tools at the time to provide the type of solutions to their problems that they need. So she doesn't know how to take care of them. She doesn't know how to help them, and so therefore she doesn't. She controls them too much because she doesn't know how to allow them to have freedom without harming themselves or getting into trouble. And then McMurphy, who, as a naive teenager, I saw as a kind of like a, freedom fighter, really is less free-spirited than he is just simply amoral. And there are some things I noticed, again, the second time that I watched it that I hadn't noticed before. For instance, he's in prison for violence and being a sexual predator. Statutory rape and getting into a lot of fights. He's not a good man. He's a morally problematic character. And then if you watch his interactions with the other characters, he is not really trying to help them. What he's trying to do is to take control of the situation. So, for instance, when he comes into the group therapy session, he kind of sits through the first one or two without saying much and watches the way they happen. And then he slowly starts to add comments in that manipulate the interaction between the others. So essentially, he's doing exactly what Nurse Ratched is doing. He's trying to take control of the situation. So in some ways, the two of them are parallel. Nurse Ratched overly controls them in order to protect them. McMurphy takes control of them and manipulates them in order to kind of push back against the structures in this structured environment. He does also kind of care for them, and he does kind of encourage them a little bit. I mean, there is some positive to what he does. For instance, he does, as I said earlier, he kind of draws them out. But at the same time, ultimately, the final problem that he causes, this party, is extremely dangerous. The character who commits suicide does so. We can blame Nurse Ratched for it. She threatens to tell his mother that he slept with this woman that McMurphy brought in during the party. But at the same time, McMurphy was the one who encouraged this woman to have sex with him. This extremely repressed, extremely troubled young man, he gets him drunk, and he has this woman have sex with him. And he's actually reluctant to do it, but they kind of peer pressure him into going into the room and having sex with her. So while you can blame Nurse Ratched for the pushing him over the edge by threatening to tell his mother about him sleeping with this woman, the whole problem was instigated by McMurphy pressuring him into going into that room and having sex with that woman. So McMurphy is as much to blame for his suicide as Nurse Ratched is. And then another subtle detail has to do with Chief. One of the things that Chief tells him when they have their longest conversation in the film is that his father had become an extremely horrible alcoholic, and it had ruined his life. And so he was afraid that he himself might have the same tendencies. And when Chief comes out during the party, McMurphy hands him a bottle of liquor. And so he knows the fears that Chief has about alcoholism, and he knows about the fact that Chief's father was destroyed by alcoholism. So him handing him that bottle of liquor is really just encouraging the destruction of his own mentality. He's encouraging him to follow his father in becoming just a crazed alcoholic. And so all of these things, all of these little subtle details tell you that what's going on here is that we've got two people who are taking parallel paths, trying to control these men, but at the same time manipulating them in ways that are destructive to them. Both are trying to manipulate the patients. Ratched is trying to solve their problems. She's unable to, and so she controls them to protect them. McMurphy rejects social norms, and so he manipulates the other patients in order to help him sabotage the order of the mental ward that he's in. Both fail to address the needs of these men in the institution. And so the rebellious character and the overly controlling character both are destructive to the people in the middle. And so the Chief hasn't been set free. I mean, let's be honest about it. I mean, he killed McMurphy, he broke the window and ran away. What's going to happen to him? They're going to track him down, and he's never getting out of the hospital. Not only has he committed murder, but he's broken the window. He's really, really lashed out at the institution. So now he's really crazy, right? So that last image of him running away is not really an image of him escaping and becoming free. It's the illusion that he has become free. So essentially, the idea here is that an overly controlled society cripples its people. Too much authority, too much strict authority cripples people. But at the same time, self-indulgent rebellion within such a society endangers the people. And then when this type of rebellion is inevitably lobotomized or disabled, such as McMurphy is, everybody else is left behind and trapped in the same dysfunctionally oppressive society. Again, what's interesting to me is that how I read it as a kid when I watched it was, freedom and openness and let's enjoy ourselves. Let's break out of the bonds of this controlled environment we live in. Is actually, it was naive. It was a little naive, and I think there is a little bit of that there. But at the same time, I don't think McMurphy, what I saw as this kind of positive character when I watched it as a kid, he's really a rather sinister character. Now, let me grant, I'm reading it on kind of a social commentary level. Ken Casey himself worked in a mental institute in Oregon when he was in college, I believe. And so he has said that this story is really about the inability of American mental institutions to take care of the people that they house. So, and it does a really good job of criticizing the mental institutions at the time. And we still have issues with that. But I think that idea about social order and rebellion is still meaningful. And I would say, as always, literature gives us things to think about in terms of reality. And so here's what I would suggest. One way to think about it. And keep in mind, I'm interpreting a text and then I'm applying that interpretation to reality. This movie isn't about this, but I'm using my thinking about it to comment on this. So let's look at what's going on in some of the cities around the country with the rioting and the disorder. Portland has been in the news the last few weeks specifically, and so we have here, we can look at this in terms of, we can create an analogy from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for this scenario. And so you have McMurphy in the form of people who are angry, frustrated with society as it is, or just using the protest as an excuse to break windows and light things on fire and destroy property and attack police stations and so on and so forth. And then you have Nurse Ratched in the form of police, and now we have federal agents or federal military, I don't know, we don't know who they are, going into, say, Portland, for instance, and attacking people. Even the peaceful protesters, even the actual protesters are being attacked sometimes by the police. Sometimes. I mean, this isn't unilateral by any means. But people being picked up and put into nondescript vans. I mean, there's some creepy stories about that. So the rioters are really not helping the situation at all. I mean, the issue of police brutality, of institutional racism, rioting doesn't solve that problem. And in fact, it's sort of, even though it's kind of illusory, it underscores the argument that, which isn't really the best argument, that law and order is going to solve these problems. But it seems like it underscores that because it says, because look at all this chaos in the streets, and you see the people on the news breaking windows and looting and burning police cars down and things like that. We need to establish law and order, right? And it underscores that argument, even if it is a little bit fake, even if that is still a weak argument, it does kind of add a little support to the people who are thinking about that and wondering whether that argument makes sense. And then on the other hand, you've got what the federal troops are doing, or the federal police or whoever they are in Portland, picking up the peaceful protesters, not going in and arresting. Although sure they're arresting some of the rioters, but picking up, pepper spraying, tear gassing people who are actually peacefully marching down the street, carrying signs, doing, the American tradition of protesting, right? Protesting against something they see as injustice in society. So the federal government doing this, it sort of underscores, and again, it's kind of illusory, the argument that, authority in our society cannot be trusted. Look at what they're doing to these peaceful protesters in Portland. Neither response is going to result in the changes we need to see in our society. We need to see some changes in police culture. We need to see some of the problems regarding racism, whether it's intentional or not. We need to see some of those problems taken care of. There are a lot of things we need, but the rioting and these federal forces going in and picking up people and putting them into unmarked vans, neither of those is going to solve it. And that kind of goes along a little bit with the story of McMurphy, the rebel. Just like we came out at the end of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with 2 people dead and all the other guys just still in the same situation they were left in before. It's the same thing with this. Burning down a courthouse is not going to solve the problem of police brutality or institutional racism. Arresting people on the streets who aren't really doing anything, and I've got nothing against arresting the people who are actually damaging property, is not going to stop the rioters. In fact, it's going to encourage them. So, anyway, that's my take on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and a little bit of application of the ideas that I took from it on the current issue in Portland. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear some comments. Tell me where I'm wrong, what I'm missing, and thanks a lot for watching.